Hi, everyone. This is Global Podcast, your window to the world. Breaking news, big ideas, your global hangout for what's happening now, and bold conversations. Wherever you are, we're bringing it to you. Let's get started.
Okay, let's unpack this right away. We're taking a deep dive into a pretty significant development in global trade. The new 26% U.S. tariffs on imports from India. This came into effect on April 2nd, 2025, under President Trump's Liberation Day initiative.
Yeah, it's crucial to understand the scale here. In 2024, India's exports to the U.S. reached a massive $87 billion.
Wow, $87 billion.
That's a really substantial amount of international trade that's now facing this new tariff.
Absolutely. The U.S. is a major trading partner for India, so this is much more than just, a minor adjustment. Our goal in this deep dive is to get to the heart of why these tariffs were imposed, what the immediate and potential consequences are for India, how India is likely to respond, and what the broader implications might be.
Right.
We know your time is valuable and you want to grasp the essentials without getting lost in jargon, so think of this as your fast track to understanding this important trade story.
So let's begin with the crucial question, why? Why did President Trump decide to implement these 26% tariffs on Indian goods?
Well, the justification seems to hinge on a couple of key points. Firstly, President Trump has repeatedly referred to India as, and I quote, a highest tariffing nation. He specifically claimed that India imposes an average tariff of 52% on American goods. Now, this isn't solely about the stated tariffs you might see listed.
Right, it's more complex.
Exactly. It reportedly also factors in other trade barriers and even currency policies.
And what's kind of fascinating about this is the way it's being framed. Trump is presenting this 26% U.S. tariff almost as a concession.
A discount, yeah.
Suggesting it's actually lower than the trade barriers American goods supposedly encounter in India. It's a very specific perspective, isn't it?
Indeed. The second major element is the trade balance. In 2024, the U.S. had a $37 billion trade deficit with India.
Meaning India exported $37 billion more to the U.S. than it imported from the U.S.
Correct. And President Trump has been very vocal about his desire to reduce this deficit and secure greater access for American products in the Indian market. This tariff appears to be a direct tool aimed at achieving that.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the bigger picture, this action aligns pretty consistently with a trade philosophy we've seen from President Trump, which prioritizes reducing trade deficits and advocating for what he considers more fair trade relationships.
Oh, okay. So the rationale seems to be rooted in these assertions of high Indian tariffs and the existing trade imbalance. Now, let's turn our attention to the immediate and potential impact on India's exports. Which sectors are likely to feel this most acutely?
Well, the information we have points to several key Indian export sectors. Pharmaceuticals are a significant one.
Huge for India.
Absolutely. India is a major global supplier of generic drugs, and the U.S. is just a crucial market for them. Then there's electronics and IT products. Those will also be affected, as will textiles.
Which employs a lot of people.
A very large number of people in India, yeah. And lastly, gems and jewelry are also on the list of exports likely to experience the most significant impact.
So by imposing a 26% tariff, the immediate effect is that these Indian goods become more expensive for American consumers and businesses.
Simple economics, really.
Yeah. Which naturally puts them at a competitive disadvantage compared to similar products coming from countries that don't face these tariffs, right?
And while economic models suggest that the overall impact on India's total GDP might be relatively limited because India's economy is quite diverse, the real concern is concentrated within these specific industries that heavily rely on the U.S. market. They could very well see a decrease in sales and, pressure on their profit margins.
Right. That makes sense. So how is India responding to this? I mean, a sudden 26% increase on such a large portion of their exports can't be welcome news.
No, definitely not. According to our sources, the initial reaction from the Indian Commerce Ministry is being characterized as a mixed bag.
Mixed bag. How so?
Well, they aren't portraying it as a complete catastrophe, but they are definitely taking it seriously. They're currently analyzing the sector-by-sector implications to get a clear understanding of the potential damage.
Interesting. So not an immediate sort of strong public outcry then. Had India taken any steps previously that might have been intended to prevent this kind of action?
Yes, it appears India had made some efforts. They had previously lowered tariffs on specific American goods, like bourbon whiskey and Harley-Davidson motorcycles.
Ah, remember that.
Presumably as a gesture to improve trade relations and perhaps forestall more significant trade barriers.
And that brings us to the ongoing discussions about a broader bilateral trade agreement between the two countries. Where do those talks currently stand in light of these new tariffs?
Those negotiations are still underway, apparently with a reported goal of finalizing an agreement by the end of 2025.
Ambitious timeline now.
Very. This tariff move will undoubtedly add complexity to those discussions. India will likely be seeking concessions to counterbalance the effect of these new duties.
You'd think so. So, beyond diplomatic efforts, what practical strategies might India consider to try and reduce this trade surplus and potentially alleviate the pressure from the U.S.?
Well, the information suggests a few possible approaches. One is to increase imports from the U.S.
Buy more American stuff.
Basically, yeah. Particularly in sectors where the U.S. has a strong export capacity, such as crude oil, liquefied natural gas, LNG, and even military equipment. Increasing imports in these areas could help to narrow that trade deficit.
That makes sense. What other options might they explore? Could they look to become less reliant on the U.S. market altogether?
Absolutely. That's almost certainly part of the long-term thinking. Diversifying their export markets is another crucial strategy. By actively working to expand trade relationships with other countries and regions, India can reduce its dependence on the U.S. market and become less vulnerable to policy changes from any single trading partner.
Okay, so it's a combination of diplomatic engagement, potentially increasing specific imports, and a broader strategy of market diversification. Now let's consider a slightly different angle. Are there any potential opportunities for India arising from these challenges? Is there a silver lining here?
Some analysts believe there could be. The argument is that this situation might actually compel India to undertake much-needed reforms of its own tariff structures.
Ah, interesting.
This external pressure could provide the impetus for creating a more open and globally competitive economy in the long run.
That's an interesting idea, a kind of forced evolution, perhaps. Beyond just lowering tariffs, what specific regulatory hurdles or bureaucratic processes might India need to address to truly become more globally competitive in the long run, considering this new U.S. policy?
That's a key question.
Yeah,
beyond just the number, the tariff rates themselves, India might look at streamlining customs procedures, improving infrastructure related to trade ports, roads, logistics, and addressing any regulatory inconsistencies that could hinder their exporters' competitiveness on a global scale. It's not just about tariffs.
Precisely. And what's also worth noting is that while India is now facing a 26% tariff, some of its major competitors, like China, are currently subject to significantly higher cumulative tariffs in the U.S.
Much higher.
In some cases, reaching up to 54%. This could potentially create an opportunity for Indian exporters to expand their market share in specific sectors, like pharmaceuticals and even semiconductors.
Semiconductors is an interesting one.
Provided, and this is the big caveat, provided they can consistently meet global quality and regulatory standards. But I mean, are the quality standards and production capacities of Indian manufacturers currently at a level to consistently and reliably fill those potential gaps left by higher tariffs on Chinese goods?
That's the critical question, isn't it? While India has made significant strides, consistent quality control, adherence to international standards, which can be very strict, especially in pharma and tech, and scaling up production to meet potentially large-scale demand, will be crucial for Indian manufacturers to effectively capitalize on this potential advantage. It's not automatic.
No, definitely not. So while there's a new hurdle, it's a lower hurdle than some others are facing, and it might even spur positive internal changes. Now, zooming out a bit, what's been the global reaction to this announcement? Are other countries paying close attention?
Oh, definitely. The announcement has generated concern in global markets. There are underlying fears, that this could signal the beginning of a broader trend of escalating trade tensions between the U.S. and its trading partners.
Ripple effects.
Exactly. Any significant new tariffs tend to create uncertainty and the potential for retaliatory measures. Markets don't like uncertainty.
And speaking of retaliation, India hasn't announced any measures yet, but is that a possibility down the line if this situation persists?
The information suggests that while India hasn't announced any retaliatory tariffs so far, they seem to be taking a measured approach.
Watching and waiting.
Analysts are cautioning that if this dispute drags on or intensifies, it could certainly strain the broader diplomatic and economic relationship between the U.S. and India, and retaliation could become a consideration. It's probably not their first choice, but it's likely on the table.
Okay. So to summarize, these new tariffs pose a significant challenge, no doubt, for India's export-oriented industries. They're likely to increase costs and reduce their competitive edge in the crucial U.S. market.
Yep, that's the downside.
However, there's also the potential for this to drive internal reforms within India, making its economy more competitive globally, and maybe even offering a possible strategic advantage over some competitors facing even higher tariffs.
The potential upside or silver lining.
Right. India's immediate response seems to be one of careful analysis, coupled with hopes for progress in ongoing trade negotiations and a consideration of diversifying their trade relationships.
That's a pretty clear overview, I think. The central dynamic here is how India manages this immediate economic pressure while also strategically positioning itself to seize any potential long-term benefits that might emerge from this shift in trade policy. It's a balancing act.
And it really seems that India's ability to effectively negotiate with the U.S. and proactively pursue the diversification of its export markets will be key factors in navigating this particular economic challenge. Negotiation and diversification seem critical.
Indeed. Which, leads to a final thought maybe for our listeners. Considering this sudden policy change and the intricate web of global trade, what are the broader implications for the future of international commerce? Are we seeing a fundamental shift? And looking beyond just tariffs, what other critical factors do you believe will ultimately determine the long-term success of India's export sector in the U.S. market? Things like quality, innovation, relationships.
Good question. It's certainly a complex situation with far-reaching consequences to ponder. Lots to think about there.